thank you everybody for coming on. Let me pick up where we left off. I'm just getting a sense for those of you we haven't talked to before. Have you picked up the book? Have you read through it? Yeah. Okay. I really like this guy. He writes in a very dense prose, and he's written my favorite, along with this one, is The Five Kingdoms. But he's a prolific author. Do anybody here speak or read French fluently?
I do.
Yeah, I'm wondering how this feels and sounds in French, because I think he writes directly into French and then translates it. Obviously, he's fluent in English, but I always wonder what it would be like if we read it in the original. The last time we finished was right before chapter 3. The question was, was anti-Semitism unleashed on October 7th, or was it always there in the world? Was there such a sea change? It was awful, and everyone knows the phrase. Every news anchor says the worst one-day atrocity and death of Jews since the Shoah, since the Holocaust. But barring that, was there really a sea change? And he seems to think there is. I'm going to postpone the verdict on that. But let's go to it. Those of you who have
Jerry,
it. Chapter
what
20.
do you mean by a sea change?
So a sea change is something that's dramatically different. It's not just a difference in degree, it's a difference in kind. So this was, Levy says, not just more dead Jews and not just terribly, murdered, but a whole sea change in the way it happened and mostly in the response that happened afterwards. I'm not so sure historically. I think some of it has to do with the internet and our availability to 24/7 news. I wonder if after the Inquisition, after the Chelmnicki massacre in Poland, after the Arab riots in pre-state Palestine, would there not have been some of this? I do think in the last 8 or 10 years, people are more emboldened to say it out loud, that which was not said in polite company. So that, I think, it is a dramatic sea change. But he's saying that this is something that has really turned the tables, Lahavdil, but kind of like the demise of the Soviet Union. What Samuel Huntington said was the end of civilization, and he speaks about this, that it so turned things upside down that it's not just more of the same, it's a complete difference. So that's
one of the other big differences is that we have the UAE, we have all the support, or the other Arab countries are quiet.
Yes, yeah, and
in other words, they're letting us fight it all out. We're basically fighting their war.
Well, and he says that's clearly one of the big differences. People were worried about the backlash. What's fascinating is that most of the Sunni countries, even though they've been, they've objected, but their objections have been very tepid. The Saudis have come out and said that they can't move forward toward normalization until the war stops, until there's a ceasefire. That's almost to be expected. But they didn't.
Said it. They said it.
They said it, but they didn't cut their ties.
Yeah.
The countries after the Abraham Accords in the first Trump administration, when they signed agreements with Israel, they didn't cut their ties. They didn't bring back their ambassadors. So his point, is that while this was obviously awful, what's saving grace, and I think Bret Stephens makes this point also, is that there are some some silver linings if you look for them, and that's one of them. The other is that this previous administration, and certainly the incoming administration, has been very supportive of Israel. 50,000 tons, if I remember the number, of armaments during the Biden administration went to Israel. So yes, awful, but at the same time, some people are trying to see where things have stood as far as, silver linings. I want to go through some of this. Chapter 3 is Amalek's bath. A really, I think, interesting title for the chapter. I want to start with a quote. If you have it, it's on page 21. It's not that long, and I'll read it. The first of these upheavals targets the Jewish soul, and it goes straight to the heart. Remember, he's a poet, he's a philosopher, he's not just a war correspondent. This is not the first time Israel has been forced into war. Okay. Not the first time it's been attacked on so many fronts. Gaza, Hezbollah, the jihadist groups on the West Bank, Iran, the Houthis of Yemen, Syria, and the Shia militias in Iraq, right? So he asks, what's the difference? Was it the stupefying effect created by the new scenario? Was it the number of dead, the number of hostages? Cause is sacred in Israel? Was it the feeling of being caught in the trap of two imperatives that, for the first time in Jewish history, seemed tragically contradictory? Eliminating Hamas and freeing the hostages, tracking the fighters through their maze of tunnels, and looking for the children and women and men whom the master blackmailers were holding at gunpoint. So was it because there were two contradictory dynamic tension points? It was to go after them, but be careful of the hostages. Was it trying to go after them, but being careful about where they were in the tunnels? And he says, he quotes the Rambam, the Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, that the highest mitzvah is the freeing of captives. And this has been known in Jewish law for 1,800 years. We'll do anything to free our captives. Jewish communities in the Middle Ages sold everything they had to ransom back the people who were stolen from them. Now, perniciously, many of you know that history, that the kingdoms who did this to get money for their own war efforts, and then they usually stole the property of the Jews if it wasn't given to them. So we've been doing this a long time. And he says, or was it the Nova Rave, the music festival, and the 364 teenagers who had come to Re'im to celebrate and who were picked off like rabbits? Or was it the abrupt piercing of the Jewish state's armor of invulnerability? So that hold on for a second. I think that's a question that is different. For Israel, deterrence is more powerful than their missiles. The worry in Arab states and Iran that something bad is going to happen to them was like another column, another brigade, another battalion. After October 7th, that sphere of invulnerability was, I wouldn't say erased, but was eradicated. And his position, along with many people in Israel also, is saying that that's dafka what happened. Kind of like after 73, although if you know the history, even though Egypt and Syria gained a tremendous military victory early on, Israel produced an extraordinary military victory later by encircling the Egyptian Third Army, by pushing back the Syrians past the Golan, even past the Litani River. It was amazing. But initially, the Arab press said, see, they're not invulnerable. See, they're not all powerful. And it really hurt their sense of deterrence. But this is different. This was Israel reeling from this, saying their intelligence and their military fell down. So that's what he's saying is different. I'm so sorry. You had a comment.
Me?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
who was that? Yeah.
What is different is the ability of Hamas. They suddenly came out looking smart. They built all these tunnels. They were able to hold off and do something like this. This wasn't an ordinary war, where where you were attacking each other. Everything was underground. And I think not only were they doing underground, but at least Hezbollah has now started. Iran is going to build something underground to protect themselves, just
Yep.
a little cubby hole, something they could all, or no, actually, it's going to connect to a hospital, so that when we hit them, they can go
No,
straight
but
to the hospital.
that's a good point. This is they're calling it the tunnel war. David?
So I think some of it's different and some of it maybe is not that different. I agree with Sheila about the tunnels and everything happening, so to speak, right before Israeli intelligence eyes, and either there's a failure of intelligence or a failure to listen to intelligence or both. Although, again, if you are the politician or government in a democracy, it's kind of hard to argue for going in preemptively, although easy to second guess, easy to armchair quarterback. On the other hand, some things seem kind of the same. I mean, things looked much bleaker early on. Now most of the tunnels are destroyed. Hamas is much eviscerated. Same for Hezbollah. When the pagers blew up, I think a lot of us were like, wow, that Israel could do that.
Right.
They claim that they've taken out all 4 of Iran's air defense systems. That's true, and they have to be a little more worried. On the other hand, we have to be more worried because if they're anywhere close to a bomb, maybe they'll rush it before Israel or the US have a chance to do something about it. So there's a lot to still be worried about, but I don't know. Yeah, he's writing, I think, pretty early on.
Yes.
And I don't know, maybe he would still be this pessimistic. That's sort of a French trait, but maybe he's too pessimistic. I hope he's too pessimistic.
David,
I'd like
they're
to add
still,
something too.
they are
let
not.
let me get to Jerry, who's had his hand up, and then want to comment. I think a lot of his pessimism isn't actually about Israel's military ability. It's about the worldwide anti-Semitism. Jerry?
No, I think that this is different than in previous incursions for 2 reasons. One is the goal that was set was going to be almost impossible, if not impossible to attain, and there was no exit strategy. In the past, whenever Israel went in and attacked Gaza, everybody knew they were going to come back out. They mowed the grass. I think that's the term that they often use.
That's the term.
So in this particular case, they said, no, we're not going to just mow the grass. We're going to get rid of them once and for all, which I think is almost literally impossible. And there's no alternative. So we're stuck in limbo here with people not knowing which way to go or what the best way to go is.
I think that's accurate. That's very different. Now, remember, we were in Israel was in Lebanon for 18 years, and that caused terrible consternation in the Israeli body politic. That's also when some of the peace movements from some of the mothers who lost sons started about finally getting out of Lebanon. Go ahead, Muse. Yes. You're muted.
Okay. Can you hear now? Can you hear now?
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
You remuted.
No, you remuted.
In the meantime, I'll talk till he gets.
I cannot hear you.
How about
There
now?
you go.
Yes,
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you. Go ahead.
Can you hear? Can you hear?
Yes,
Yes.
go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, go ahead.
Okay, okay, I'll make it brief. And everything that we said is correct, but let me say, try to summarize it in a brief way. It's not, like I said last time, it's not that we didn't know in 75 years of the existence of Israel that the Arabs going to take us out from this land and dump us into the sea and slaughter us. This was always the slogan. But the question is not if they will try to do it after all the wars and all that, but when they're going to do it. So now we come to the question of when. Here's what my explanation of when, what I believe. They thought the last year, especially when there was demonstration in Israel against Netanyahu, half of the country was this way, the other one this way. They said we are weak, but they didn't understand the nature of Israel. So they thought they're going to surprise us and, and do some damage. The second thing about the hostages, so it's a parallel thing. The hostages were the limited factor in this war because we care about hostages, we care about civilians. So this was a limited factor in the Israeli response, and it still is because we didn't want to hurt the civilians and more than that, the hostages that we all know. And we're still trying to get those hostages, whatever the situation is with them. So they took advantage of that. I'm not going to elaborate anymore, but our big brother, USA, was also not that strong in the world as far as the image, okay, without getting into politics. So putting all these things together, they said, this is the time. And they didn't even consult with Hezbollah, like this speaker who came to the temple to say, which we know, if Hezbollah was joining the Hamas at the same time, it would have been worse. You follow me? So we dealt with Hamas alone. That's all I have to say, and let's continue from there.
All right, so
Okay,
I'd like to make some comments here.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, in this particular instance, this is not a typical war. They don't have any uniforms. We're not fighting an army. We're fighting terrorists. That's number one. Number two, Tehran has no problem getting a bomb from North Korea because they are partners in this triumvirate or foursome between Russia, North Korea, China, and Tehran. So I think that the point is I wouldn't worry about them finishing their own nuclear power, having their own bomb, because they could always get it, trade oil with North Korea, and they get the bomb. But I think more important, and we keep saying the same thing, in this particular instance, we are not fighting an army. And the only way that we can prevail is the way that we're doing it, right or wrong, in the eyes of the rest of the world. I'd like to see them do it any other way.
So I'll add to that. Clearly, that's one of the sea changes. It's not a nation state. And we've said before, I've written and spoken, but other people have said the same. A nation state will typically feel as if they have something to lose. A guerrilla war or a militant or a terrorist group has far less to lose. They typically don't have territory. They don't have, citizens that they care about or take care of. So they're a much more dangerous foe because deterrence only works if they're worried about losing something. Even at the height of the Cold War, the leaders of the Soviet Union weren't completely insane enough to think that, oh, so what if they have second strike capability? We'll just go after them. It's okay. The problem is also when even a nation state sees things differently, like Iran did in the Iran-Iraq war, where they sent waves of young boys to be killed, or in some way, like Hamas has demonstrated that they really don't care how many Palestinians die. Then deterrence doesn't work as much. The other issues is that that have been changed. The Cold War, thought to be over, is now heating up again. So that's created, like you said, this axis, this new axis, what he terms the five kingdoms, and a desire in the States by many people, not just the incoming administration, to move back toward some degree of isolationism. I'm sure it's not a surprise. I think that's a dangerous thing for the world, much less for the United States. What was most devastating for him and for others was something entirely different, not just about the military. It was that piercing of what he called the invulnerability, or the image of invulnerability. After October 7th, even though they reclaimed a lot of territory, even though they went to town on Hamas and even Hezbollah and Iran, it emboldened other people to say, well, maybe we can do something. The other issue is how this has changed, is what it sparked worldwide. I mean, all of you are savvy consumers. My desk is piled with news snippets about anti-Semitism in across the globe and in this country. Combat Anti-Semitism Movement, CAM, relatively new umbrella organization. This week, Global Anti-Semitism Report. So this isn't like the ADL, they used to publish an annual report. Now we get a weekly, and I get in my inbox 3 daily reports about what's going on. You know, and it used to be that some people could say, well, that's overblown, and that's Jewish paranoia, and that's one unkind word said, you know, across the country of 320 million people. But now it's like an avalanche. And ironically, counterintuitively, the people who were attacked, Israelis and Jews, are getting the brunt of some of the worst, you know, anti-Semitic attacks after we were attacked. And that's what he says is a complete sea change. There were a couple other hands.
I just want to agree with that, but also the effect it's had on in the United States and elsewhere, how we're all, you know, people who don't know what they're talking about have found the cause. Basically, they just found the cause. And that's that everything we're doing is wrong. And that's different.
So yes, I believe it is. Although we can all point to.
It was quieter before. It was quieter before. They were against us, fine. But now it's an active campaign.
Look, and that's not
Israel.
Right, and that's not to romanticize how wonderful things used to be in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, right? There were anti-Semitic attacks. There were the neo-Nazis marched in Skokie. We all know these examples. There have been people in the entertainment world and the sports world, you know, who have said things, the Mel Gibsons of the world. But this is turning on a garden hose into a fire hose. And I think that that's very, very different as well. His contention is, and I don't know if he's being consciously hyperbolic or he really believes it, there is nowhere in the world where Jews are safe. Now, indeed, not even in Israel. That's the perception. And this is, he's saying, this is the revenge of Amalek, that we never completely destroyed Amalek, perhaps like Hamas. It's impossible to completely destroy Amalek. And what happens is that Amalek will come back one way or another, in one form or another. So I wanted to, we asked this question before, but I'm curious still, those of you who have connections with people on college campuses, children or grandchildren, how much of this is just the 5 or 10 Ivy League schools we hear about over and over and over again, or are the people whom you know, are they experiencing any of this in the schools that don't get headlines, the ones that aren't on the Ivy League list? Do you get a sense about how this is being played out?
I asked my grandson.
I'd like to say something.
Yeah, please. Who's that?
Yeah. One of
Glenda. Yeah. Okay.
Is that the organizations on campus have been, I think we've never seen anything like that. It's been growing for the last 10 years. I know my niece and nephew were here like 5 years ago. He was teaching at Indiana University there, and my niece was working with the Hillel there, and she told me then about Jews who were against Israel. and what they, so I mean, they have been organizing and building for years, and I think this was an opportunity to come out. And I don't think we've seen that on campuses, the organization that they've had, and catching a lot of people who aren't Arab, Muslim, and I've gotten Jews, other kids, and that's I think that's different. And again, again, maybe it's not different. I think Israel's been put in a no-win situation. There is no good way out.
Well, and I think another thing that's different is, and it's pretty well documented, the money and the strategy that's gone into this. There's a film, a quote, documentary, but it's really, I believe, manipulative propaganda. It's called Israelism. If you haven't seen it yet, you probably will. You believe, trust me, you have to be in the right frame of mind to watch the damn thing all the way through. It's really, really hard to watch. It's essentially making the case that Israel has manipulated and brainwashed young American Jews to believe that they should be pro-Israel. And they take snippets from our own YouTube videos about birthright and young people going to Israel programs or serving in the army. It's slick, it's well produced, and it's going to get an official airing or screening probably in December. The money that's behind that, no doubt from Qatar or maybe from the UAE, that's also new. The strategy, and it's a long range strategy that people are doing, is very, very different. And so it's not just Israel fighting nation states, or even just Israel fighting terrorist groups. It's the American Jewish and the Australian Jewish and the European Jewish community fighting this kind of propaganda. So that, I think, unfortunately, is very, very different. There's somebody else. Yeah, David.
So I'm going to relate this to Debbie and I just got back from the synagogue civil rights journey. We started out at Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was King's pulpit and is now Raphael Warnock's pulpit. And there was this ties in with this in this sense that there are people who don't really know what the Jewish position is, if you will, what our relationship is to the land, or even very much about how we understand our biblical stories. There was a pastor from, I think, Tennessee, who was the guest speaker. He gave the sermon instead of Warnock. And there were 3 groups of Jews in the church. 2 of them with the tour company we were with, and a third one, all from different synagogues. Warnock welcomed his Jewish friends, and then he introduces this guy who gives a sermon about Hagar. And we thought, oh, wow, it's about this week's Parsha. Isn't that something? Except that what he was saying about Hagar essentially makes an equivalence with the Palestinian plight, if you will. And Abraham kicked out Hagar, and we need to pay attention to Hagar. And he's saying this right in front of our, one's Jewish friends, some of whom were a little enthusiastic, and most of us were sitting there, if not with our jaws dropped open, at least very quiet, thinking to ourselves, we have a lot of work to do to make people understand, for example, who are the actual indigenous people, as it were? Who's returning to the land? And
well, and speaking about that, I saw a video produced in Australia that was, I thought, not a video, a speaker from Australia that I thought made the brilliant point that the left is very supportive of indigenous peoples, right? So we're by definition indigenous. We've reclaimed an ancient language. It's the cradle of our civilization. It's the cradle of our culture and our religion. It's everything that they would say about the Aborigines in Australia, about the Native Americans, or the First Peoples in Canada, and yet somehow that's been stripped from us. I'm wondering, in his church, did Reverend Warnock, I don't know, say something to soften the sermon?
Sadly, he did not. And what was as disturbing as anything else is that I don't think he felt that this was a sermon against Jews, or that Jews, at least in America, wouldn't somehow support. I just think that, sadly, there's just a complete lack of understanding of what our position actually is, and a tendency that goes hand in hand with this idea of from the river to the sea. Which river, which sea? Oh, I don't know. All they know is that somebody seems to be bearing the brunt of this war, even though if this were the United States, sad to say, usually dropping bombs from the air so as to preserve our own soldiers, there would probably be 250,000 dead Palestinians in Gaza at the very least.
No
But
doubt.
Israel never gets credit for trying desperately to limit the casualties, and the Western press tends to believe Hamas's numbers, which are still not anywhere close to 250,000. I mean, every death is tragic, but it's war.
100%. Jerry?
Jerry,
I want to
can you
say
hear me?
that
Let Jerry and then Yossi. Go ahead.
I was going to say that your example of indigenous people, because they are the underdog, they have no power, they're downtrodden. But wait, we have an army, we can make war. So they don't include us because it doesn't fit the model that they're setting up.
I think you're
Right.
right, and that doesn't even have anything to do with whether we control the weather or not.
Yeah. And in the States, because of intersectionality, we're deemed to be white and privileged. So it's going against us in both ways. Israel's powerful. Israel has an army, and we shouldn't say anything because we're privileged and all of us have money and drive fancy cars, right? So that's the perception out there. Yossi, and then
Yeah, let me say something. I respond. There was two traumatic tragedies in the Jewish history in the last 80 years or more. One was the Holocaust, and the other one is October 7th. And we haven't learned yet from it. And still, I mean, I can understand when a goy or somebody doesn't know. By the way, I just came from a seminar in Columbus, and I have some good friends, and they're all Catholics, and I mean Christians, and they admire Israel, and they know I'm from Israel. They just kept saying, "God bless you, and we are with you," and they're sincere. But let's say it this way: if a guy says I don't like the Jews, or is misinformed, or is just hillbilly, I can live with that. But when when a Jewish kid in campus, or like she said before, this lady, they were against Israel, and there's many in Berkeley University, you in California, so you know how free they are and how leftists they are. I'm ashamed. This is the real danger of the Jewish people. It's our own kind, our own people.
Well, and somebody called them as a Jews. I've been on umpteen different panels and debates when I was in the Bay Area, in Cleveland, now here. And as soon as somebody say, well, as a Jew, you think, oh, good God, really? That's like the word. So we call them as a Jews. That the first thing they say is as a Jew, and then they go about trashing Israel. Yeah, Helene, go ahead.
So you asked about the children in university.
Yeah.
I have a granddaughter who doesn't want to walk. She's the top of her class in Maryland in business and economic. She doesn't want to walk. She is afraid to show any sign of Judaism on her. And it's not started now. This is in the making the last 20, 30 years. They were brainwashing our children. My kids are in the 50s now, 50 and late 40s. they were brainwashed in universities, in top universities they went, against Israel and against occupation of Gaza and everything. And no matter what I talk to them, what I explain to them, nothing helped. Literally, and I'm sure that the money from Iran, Qatar, all those countries had a lot to do. They were putting teachers, students, advisors in top places to literally, they didn't educate the children. They just brainwashed them.
So let me ask you about that. This is something professionally I've heard for years and years, that if only Israel had a better Hezbollah, some people translate that as propaganda, some people translate that as public relations, but spokespeople. If Israel had a more nuanced spokespeople who spoke with American slang and not a thick accent, and didn't come off as cartoonish or stereotypical. I tend to think that in the last 10 years, certainly for this war, Israel put up some very good spokespeople. How much of an issue do you think it's that we need to get better at our message and our messenger, or it wouldn't matter one way or another?
Pure hatred against Jews all through history. And we are at fault that we didn't teach the young generations here. They are literally ignorant about world history.
Okay, but I'm also speaking about the people on the news shows, whichever one you watch, or the people who are interviewed on radio, the spokespeople for Israel. They typically, here's a Palestinian, here's an Israeli. It doesn't matter if it's equal time. That's been the argument, and I'm wondering, does that resonate, or it wouldn't matter? They could stand on their head and it still wouldn't matter. David.
I think it would matter,
Okay.
unfortunately.
Yeah, David, and then Sheila.
I think that there are organizations that are, and particularly on working on campus, trying to expose shoddy scholarship, et cetera, that's essentially anti-Semitic. So I don't think it's absolutely bleak in that respect, but it's a game of catch-up. And the Jews, if you will, started late on this, and we're trying to catch up. Same with the Israelis. I do think it's a mixed bag, because there is a tendency, I think, for Israel to say relatively little, probably to protect their own soldiers, and to not give up battlefield information. It's what I've often joked with Debbie. She'll tell you that I do this, is if I know a certain something, we're in trouble, because if I know it, everybody knows it, and we shouldn't know that. That should be classified by the Israelis. On the other hand, there's a tendency, I was listening to something on NPR on my way home from work, and they essentially reported something about the situation in Gaza, where they interviewed 2 or 3 different people who were Palestinians, and then they said that the Israelis had no comment. That didn't come off very well, at least for the listeners of NPR. So I think that it's a combination. Some of it is what Israel is willing to say or not willing to say, but a certain amount of it really, I think, is anti-Semitism, because it felt like these particular Palestinians were being thrown softballs, at least in this report. Oh, we're so sorry to hear that you're suffering in this particular way. What do you think is the cause of that? Not a one of them said Hamas was the cause of that. They all said Israel was the cause of that.
Yeah,
I heard that.
Yeah, Jerry, go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Jerry, and then Sheila.
It's a no-win situation for Israel, because no one likes a Jew with power. And that's the situation we face ourselves in. If you think back to the late 40s and the 50s, Israel was darling of the left. I mean, Pete Seeger sang songs about it. Harry Belafonte sang song about Israel because we were the David. We were the underdog in those situations. Once we gained power, no one liked us, and nobody ever will.
I think that's right. It's something, if Josh was on this, he would tell you, I've been telling him that for years and years. And early on, it sounded so terrible and so cynical. And now either I've gotten smarter or he's gotten smarter, but I think he's agreed with me 100%. Sheila?
One of the main problems is we haven't educated our own kids. We had somebody here, one of the speakers at our weekend, she pointed out our own kids don't know. They probably don't know where, when they're talking about from the sea to the
river to the
wherever,
sea.
that they don't even know it. And that's what Helena said. These kids have no education, no background about geography. They don't study geography. They don't study any basic facts of history. But I just want to bring up, I don't like to compare us to Ukraine, but Ukraine has gotten off easier because of Israel. They're so busy yelling about Israel that they haven't attacked Ukraine.
Well, yeah, look, the world, and that's part of these five kingdoms, and I wanted to go into that because I think in a very short book, he writes about geopolitics really brilliantly. He also said that, I think he was raising it rhetorically. This was the return of evil. And then he asks his own question, come on, has evil ever left us? There is ISIS in Rwanda and Darfur. There is the myth that evil had been erased. So that's one thing, that myth has been overturned. The other thing, kind of counterintuitively, was not only has there always been evil, but evil against Jews has been modified because some of us have allowed the Shoah to be universalized. Jews have been at the forefront of saying some version of like Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, which I think takes things away from the African-American community. So now Jews have been saying, except now we've turned it over. Yes, of course, many people died during the Holocaust. 20 million people died in the Holocaust. The Roma died, and homosexuals died, and socialists died. So I've heard Jewish after Jewish speakers say the Holocaust is not just a Jewish thing, trying to say that, come on, man, we're all in this together. What was done with, I think, misguided attempts was to so universalize as to say it's not a Jewish thing at all, that it's prejudice generally, but anti-Semitism specifically isn't part of it. And I think that's one, ahistorical, and two, it's come around to bite us because when people hear that, they say, well, see, it's not a Jewish thing. It's just a thing. It's just a human thing. And that's eroded our own history. Sonia, you were going to say something?
Yeah, Joey, a short comment.
Yeah.
You know how you punish the young people in campuses?
Yeah.
Israel can deny them all the applications that we developed for the iPhone. Yeah. That will send a message. You understand?
Yeah.
No apps. Just go to TikTok.
Yeah,
so they'll understand.
Yeah, I know.
When you deny those privileges, they'll understand.
Right. That's not going to happen, but they should only know how much. I mean, there's a lot of things online saying that, all right, you don't like Israel. That means don't eat cherry tomatoes. Don't use your cell phone. Don't use Waze. Don't use GPS.
What did Hamas produce? What did they invent?
Right. Yeah. Look, it's a great argument, but it's just not going to happen.
But take away the iPhones and they'll
sure.
Suffer.
Yeah, Sonia, were you going to say no? Okay, so he goes into what he calls the empire of Hamas, and he talks about his book that he wrote a number of years ago, 2018, I think, or 2017, called the Empire and the Five Kings. It's an allusion, actually, to something that's in Breshit that we read a couple of parshiot ago about Melchizedek and the five kings fighting with Abraham. Now he says the empire is the US and the Western democracies. The ones fighting against that, the five quote unquote kings, are Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and the Sunni Arab states. Why them is because each one wants to reclaim its ancient glory. Russia wants to go back to the time of Peter the Great, not even the Soviet Union, but Peter the Great. Chinese want to go back to the Ming Dynasty. The Turks want to reclaim the Ottoman Empire. Iran wants to go back 3,500 years ago to the Great Persian Empire, and the Arab Sunni states want to go back to the Umayyad and the Abbasid sultans. So each one is looking at its own history. And I remember in graduate school, we read some amazing poetry from Arab nationalists saying, you know, if only we could go back in time to the great Salah al-Din during the Crusades, where we were mighty. And how is this that Christians who never bathed, who smelled, who were disgusting and barbaric, and we had the height of civilization, which was kind of true during that time, how did they beat us? What happened to us? And now look at us compared to the Jews, compared to the Christians in the West. What happened to our glorious civilization? They want to reclaim, and the same thing with the Ottomans, the Turks, and the same thing with the Chinese and with the Russians. Putin says all the time in open sources that the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the worst day of his life. But he doesn't want to go back to the days of Khrushchev and Brezhnev and God forbid, Gorbachev, whom he really hates. He wants to go back to Peter the Great and Catherine to get the old empire back again. So now these five are joined by North Korea, and now Hamas is on the scene. And what Levy makes the point really interestingly was that after 9/11, the U.S., you know, went into Afghanistan, and they had the support of the world. France, after the Charlie Hebdo murders and terrible things going on in France, had the support of the Western world. Israel's attacked, and except for the U.S. and a couple, you know, tepid votes in their fan, they light up the Eiffel Tower, very nice, thank you, and a couple other things. Their support is eroded completely. And while Hamas, not only their enemy, Israel, doesn't get support, Hamas gets support. So from North Korea, from China, from Russia, from Turkey, from, of course, Iran. So that's the difference, that the attacker is being supported, and that who was attacked, Israel and Jews, are not only not getting support, except in rare circumstances, but are getting attacked for retaliating. Yes, Sheila, you're muted. Yes.
But actually, the countries, Lebanon, now Syria, they are being attacked also.
Mhm.
They are not getting support because Russia and China, those places don't care about them.
Right.
They just don't want it to be Israeli. They want their control, to whatever extent they have control in these countries. They want it. So they don't give a damn about their people.
Well, and remember, we talked about this before, that you know, it's terrible to say, but what Hamas and Hezbollah throw them into, and Islamic Jihad, they're much smaller. I know it sounds politically incorrect or maybe even racist to some. I don't believe it is. You can hold it up with empirical facts. They don't care about their own Arab brothers. They don't care. And matter of fact, they win when there are more Arab children dead on the news, when there are more Palestinians dead in Gaza. And the brave Palestinians, you know, it's not so easy, but the brave ones who speak up, they know damn well they're being held hostage by Hamas as much as the Israelis are.
Yeah.
Okay. What Levy says is that all of this has nothing to do with a war between East and West. There's a lot of people who've said, oh, this is a proxy war. Like I said, Samuel Huntington wrote in 98 or 99, this is the clash of civilizations. The old wars were between states. The new war is going to be between cultures and civilizations. But Levy's point is that no, it's not so broad like that. It's really back to East and West, back to liberal democracies and autocracies, because lining up with Hamas is the big five: Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and North Korea, right? So this is as bald-faced axis of evil as there's been since World War II. The problem is that the other Western liberal democracies are either whispering their support or they're quiet completely. So that I think is, the votes in the UN, the calls for a ceasefire, which we'll talk about. That's all coming from the people who should be our allies, Israel's allies and the West's allies. Okay. I wanted to talk a little bit about, yes, go ahead.
Can I say one quick word?
Yeah,
Can
please.
I say something? One
Sure.
quick thing. Hypothetically speaking, now I'm going to make a very rough statement. Suppose Israel was eliminated, no more Israel. Would a war between the East and West cease? People will hug each other, dance Saba Nagila? If Israel was not in existence, what's the next step between the East and West and all this garbage?
I think that's a great, legitimate philosophical question. Awful, but a legitimate
Is Israel
question.
standing on the way?
So,
Is that what it is?
No. I'm wondering, what do you all
Let's think
think?
about it, but that's the point I made.
If there were no, it's a legitimate question. If Israel was not on the page, would there be peace in the world? Would Russia and China embrace the US? Right.
No, they would
Yeah.
they would all fight over the area. Remember, nobody wants the Palestinians. So they would all fight over that little piece of territory. Israel is the land of Israel is what's valuable. I mean, you can do things with it because the Israelis have irrigated it and produced, made it productive. So they would all just fight about it and destroy it. The way they destroyed when they Hamas took over Gaza, they went ahead and destroyed everything that was Israeli, just because it was Israeli. Just because it was Israeli, they will tear down every building in Israel instead of using what they have.
The reason why I like Yossi's question is that so many people, statesmen, leaders, countries, individuals say, it's some version of it's all the Jews' fault. It's all the Israelis' fault. If it wasn't for Israel, there'd be, but it's a great philosophical exercise. Take Israel off the map. Would peace break out between Saudi Arabia and Iran? No, they hate each other for centuries. Would it break out between the Maronite Christians and the Sunni and Shia Muslims in Lebanon? No, of course not. So to say that it's all Israel, is also ahistorical. Jerry.
Israel is a sideshow. It happens to be an easy target. Everyone knows that it's an easy target. So they all shoot it down, but it's really not the crux of the issue that there is in Israel. The crux of the issue are all the other things you're talking about in terms of geopolitics. So if there is no Israel, there'd be new enemies. Each one would declare who the next enemy is of them, even without there being a Jewish state.
So, Sonia.
My question is, when in the last 2,000 years has there not been some war?
I can't find it. That's right. There has always been, and whether it's over food or the new wars will be over water, or the old wars over oil, or over ego or land.
Especially in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, and
especially Israel. There's always
And
fat land's been it.
there's maybe 16 million of us scattered around the world. We have not even, you should all, I'm sure you all know, we have not even repopulated ourselves since the Shoah. There was probably on the onset of the war, like in the early 30s, supposedly about 18 or so, 18 million, 18.5 million Jews worldwide. Maybe there's 16, maybe a little bit more worldwide now, after all those years. So we are minuscule. In the States, we're about 2% of the population. In the world, we're, I believe, 0.2 or 0.25%.
Around
So
here.
it's remarkable that we have such power over the world being so small, you know, debating wars and everything else. Who else? Okay. I wanted to look a little bit at, there's a chapter 6, it's called Events Can Be Erased. I think he writes really movingly, and it's frustrating, but I think he's right. Part 2 is called Negationism in Real Time, and I think it's a clever word. I don't think the word exists, but he's made it, so okay, fine. Negationism, the phenomenon of erasing or negating either a person, an individual, a tribe, or a whole country. And his point is that slowly, gradually, strategically, Israel is being negated off the map and off the equation. So what his point is philosophically, it's Israel, or the world's relationship with Israel, made the world forget October 7th. So follow the logic. The world is absolving itself from its own responsibility. It's the Jews who did this. It's the Jews who deserved it, and they pushed us to focus on their suffering. Hamas owned their own crimes. They posted pictures, right, on those, what do you call it, the GoPro cameras that they wore. They were very proud. They didn't try to hide what they did. They posted it immediately on the internet. In spite of the evidence of them not hiding their crimes and being proud of it, the world almost immediately hushed up and didn't speak about their crimes, or either they believed none of it. A New York congressperson at the time, I think he's been voted out, Jamal Bowman, a progressive, a member of the Squad, a supporter of women, supporter of the Me Too movement, questioned whether Israeli women were raped and called the accusations propaganda. This is somebody who had been saying all along, believe women, you know, support the Me Too movement. And then Israelis and Jewish women were saying, oh yeah, it's a movement, Me Too, unless you're a Jew, right? We should all believe women. We don't have to hear them say 5 times that they were raped or assaulted. We should immediately believe them. But this was questioned. This was saying we have no proof. The main feminist groups didn't support their Israeli or Jewish sisters. In the French context, leftists were abandoned by Jews and anti-Semites. It was the anti-Dreyfusards, like during the Dreyfus period, France was almost split down the middle between the pro-Dreyfus, the Dreyfusards, and the anti-Dreyfusards. And this is like a reclaiming of the anti-Dreyfusards, blaming everything once again on the Jews. Even the hostages were erased. In New York, I don't remember in Cleveland, I know in LA, where people were putting up the posters of the hostages, people were going around defacing them, you know, Xing them out or tearing them off. How badly must you hate somebody if you tear the picture of a 4-month-old baby who is hostage, who is kidnapped, or the picture of a senior citizen, a grandparent who did do nothing, but it was torn down. And I'm sure you've all seen these terrible videos in YouTube about people, you know, angry, I mean, really angry and cursing how dare you put up Jewish victims? In the UN, Guterres, his first speech after October 7th was that this has to be in the context of the suffering and the suffocating occupation of 56 years. No talk about Israel withdrawing from Gaza in 2005. No talk about the victims at all in Israel. Only a talk about the occupation. Let me read you a passage about the UN. In the race to make the hostages invisible, negating them, to put distance between ourselves and the deaths of October 7th, and to relativize their torment, it was the United Nations that competed the hardest and took the first prize. Of course, it had already been some time since the UN lost its moral dignity in the eyes of many militant defenders of human rights. I remember Bosnia. He was a war correspondent in Bosnia, where for 4 years running, the UN was unable to name the aggressors and stop the siege of Sarajevo. I remember Rwanda, where it awaited the end of the killing before distinguishing the perpetrators from the victims. Not to mention Ukraine, where Russia's let itself fall into the trap of a terrorist Putin. And then October 7th happened. Right off the bat, Secretary General Antonio Guterres set the tone by condemning only the suffering occupation enduring for 56 years by the people of Gaza. Not one mention of Hamas, not one mention of Israeli hostages. Here's a couple other things about the UN. Francesca Albanese, who's awful, like bloody awful. She's a special liaison for human rights in the occupied Palestinian territories. That's her title. Passing over the massacre, she started by concentrating on the response, which she described as the monstrosity of our centuries. The monstrosity of our century, not counting anything else. On March 26th, continuing her moral blindness, she had the nerve in a report entitled Anatomy of a Genocide to condemn Israel for perpetrating acts of genocide and declined to examine those events, October 7th, as they were beyond the geographic scope of her mandate. Over and over and over again, the UN, and I have to tell you, as somebody with a graduate degree in international relations, I was, when the first time I saw the UN and there's the words of Isaiah, our prophet, on the wall of the UN, I teared up. I thought this was, flawed, imperfect, but this was the organization that had such a Jewish heart to it that was going to lead to peace. And the way that it's been so twisted and so bastardized into what it was supposed to be, into what it is now, is just, that's its own crime. And it just hurts to say that, because after the League of Nations, after the First World War, the idea that that FDR had, to change what the attempt for the League of Nations into something that could keep peace worldwide was, gallant and brave and courageous. And now look what we have. So the UN, and those of us who know Israeli history know that in 1967, Nasser essentially said to the UN, to Utant, who was the Secretary General at the time, skedaddle, leave. And they did, with their tail between their legs. So it's no wonder why Israelis feel the way they do about the UN. David?
So a specific example, recently Hezbollah, whether on purpose or just because they no longer have as much capability as they had before, launches rockets at UNIFIL. What's the first knee-jerk reaction? The Israelis attacked UNIFIL.
Right.
Then after they realize it's not the Israelis, almost grudgingly, they say, well, maybe it was Hezbollah and maybe it was an accident. So that's just one in a long line. The problem with the UN is it's an oxymoron. It is, we don't have a united world. We have a world with different blocks. One of the large blocks is the Arabs, who have, I don't remember how many countries in the UN, and we have just one little one. And the other problem with the UN is that there are plenty of autocracies, some of which have vetoes in the Security Council.
Right, right.
Needless to say, so do we, the United States. But there are a lot of reasons, and I'm only scratching the surface of why the UN is the way the UN is. But I think for a lot of Americans, all it is a pretty building to visit in New York, and nobody understands what it was supposed to be or what it is now any more than they understand where is the river and where is the sea and what does it mean from the river to the sea.
Yeah, it's a shame because, like I said, in theory, it was a brave and courageous attempt at doing something. The League of Nations was supposed to lead to no more wars. That didn't, because there was no teeth to it. The Security Council built into the UN was supposed to, change that. It didn't. I would still say, and I would have friends who would be aghast at me saying that, there are elements of the UN, like the World Health Organization, a few other things that do some good in the world, thankfully. But what UNRWA does and what UNIFIL does in the permanent refugee status of Palestinians through the UN has just eradicated all the good that they could do. And when we say that, people say, "Oh, look at the Jews, lambasting the UN," but it's understandable. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Would we be better off without the UN? Maybe without their power, but at least they all have a place to come and fetch to each other.
There is,
and we know how they're all feeling, where otherwise it would be harder to know what they're thinking if they're not all together.
Look, at the end of the day, yes, I believe there is some value, but it's painful to know that Israel has received more condemnations than all other states combined. Syria, Afghanistan, for God's sakes, China with what they've done with the Uyghurs, over and over. I think Syria actually a number of years ago was a rotating member on the Human Rights Council. It's just absurd.
That's right.
And they have the temerity and the chutzpah to level the finger at Israel when these autocracies, you talk about women's rights and gay rights and anybody's rights or voting rights for, nothing. But they level a condemnation after condemnation against Israel.
And when they're doing that, and they're simultaneously killing more of their own people than Israel is remotely killed in Gaza, nobody says a word.
None.
Well, when Assad, when Hafez al-Assad killed about 30,000 of his own people in a poison gas attack, nothing, garnished. What China does, what the Russians do, I almost said the Soviets, over and over again, nothing. But Israel, David made the point, they try desperately to minimize casualties. There was an NPR piece just 2 days ago about a new drone developed by Israel that has both a camera and a automatic weapon attached to the drone. So they can take out, and the piece said, they can take out literally one target at a time. So I'm thinking, listen, you don't want quote unquote indiscriminate killing, which actually does not happen, but you don't want civilians and collateral damage. I get that. So this is a way that in modern warfare, one individual can be targeted and taken out so that it's not a whole village or a whole family or even, the wife or the child next to the person, but it's one person. Instead of saying, listen, war is terrible anyway, we get that, but this is an attempt to minimize collateral damage. What the piece said was, isn't this terrible? Look at the weapons of war that Israel is developing. So you can't win for losing. you don't want us to take out, civilians. Okay, we'll come up with a way to take out just the bad guy. Nope, that's not good enough.
And you brought up the word genocide, a word that exists because we had to find a way in the world to describe the attempt to systematically eradicate every single Jew, and it gets thrown about and bandied about and then used against Israel when
Right.
they're explicitly not trying to kill every Palestinian.
Yeah. Yeah, and where Hamas and Hezbollah, in their charters are the definition of genocide, where Hamas said not, quote, just every Israeli, which obviously would be bad enough, or not just soldiers would be bad enough, but every Jew, right? And in Amsterdam, they weren't saying, let's go get the Israelis. They were saying, we're going on a Jew hunt. So
Because
how much more do we need?
Because as Jerry said, from their point of view, if the Jews aren't going to be compliant Jimmies, there shouldn't be any.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jerry.
Yeah, Yossi.
We're trying to find justice in a world that doesn't have justice. It's like a kangaroo court. You know the outcome. Sheila said something right, and I'm thinking, except maybe one unit of the UN, the League of Nations was created after World War I or II, I don't remember.
World War
He had
I.
a function. World War I. And he had a function. He was respectful. He did a lot of things. Between World War I and II, maybe after World War II, they did still some work. It's useless. The Security Council is biased. We know all that. We know all that. It's obvious. We don't have to discuss it. Israel has no chance, and we don't have to justify ourselves. So I'm saying, as an Israeli, action speaks louder than words. Israel knows we have to do the work and hopefully create some space for ourselves. You're not going to justify anything because they hate you and they're going to continue hating you. And the more you're trying to find mercy and justice, they look down at you as a coward. I know we are small. We cannot take the whole world. We are 1.2% of the population and take US as a big brother, but at least make a statement. You follow me? You're not going to get justice. We can cry forever.
As David said, the world hates, or somebody, maybe Jerry, I'm sorry, the world hates Jews with power. Dara Horn, whose book I appreciated, said they only love dead Jews. That's another phrase. And Yossi Klein Halevi, one of my favorite authors, said, I would rather be condemned than pitied. And I think that sums it up. I'd rather, have people come down on us hard for trying to save our own lives than be pitied because we were killed again. Yes, do the right thing. Yes, try to minimize civilian casualties. Yes, go to the bargaining table, go to the negotiating table, try to find an interlocutor. Yes, we have power, we have responsibility to use it right. But at the end of the day, don't bend over so much, because the only thing they want, is a powerless dead Jew. We know what that looks like. So we'll do what we think is right. We're not going to be measured by the standards of other people. We'll measure our own morality. Thank you very much. But if we want to do things solely to be loved, that's a losing bargain. No matter what we do, is not going to happen. There's a chapter 7 where he talks about, I think really brilliantly, 3 traps of common sense. We may only have time to do one of them. One of them is the yes, but. For example, the Ivy League presidents at Yale and Columbia, Cornell, I think, a number of them, that famous or infamous press conference, they looked so absurd when they were asked, and they were asked, to make a point. Certain Congress people, they had their own agenda. It doesn't matter. They were asked, is the call for river to the sea, or is the call for eradicating Israel or Jews, is it anti-Semitic? And one after the next, 3 women presidents, one of whom stepped down already, said it depends on context. Yes, there is a pogrom, but what about apartheid? Yes, but Jews are privileged. So the yes, but is yes, it was terrible, but Jews are privileged. Yes, it was terrible, but what about the Israeli right? Yes, but what about the occupation? And in the UN, Guterres said the Hamas attack was terrible, but it didn't occur in a vacuum. It has to be understood in the context of Israel's occupation. So that's one whole piece, the yes, but argument. Yes, awful, but what about this? Actually, in logic and debate, it's called whataboutism. It moves people off the subject to say, oh, yeah, sure, but what about this? There is no context. There is no whataboutism. It should stand on its own. The second argument, the second theme is about the ceasefire. So I'll set the scene as he does in his book. Terrorists became bolder. They didn't just attack a theater like they have in France, or they didn't just attack like the Twin Towers on 9/11. They attacked an entire country. Hamas then assembled a group of friends and reinforcements. Unlike Al-Qaeda and unlike ISIS, who had basically no support in the world, they had the support of the five kingdoms, Russia, China, Iran, Turkey, and Sunni Arabs. Israel is in a very different place than the US after 9/11, or after France, after the Charlie Hebdo newspaper killings. The US and France faced an isolated enemy with support. The opposite. Israel faced an enemy with support, and they were not supported at all. And so that the title of his book, Israel Alone. Hamas has support, and Israel Dafka has no support. So what happens? The world then calls for a ceasefire. Now, after 9/11, no one demanded a ceasefire with Afghanistan. No one asked for a compromise with assassins. But like Levy says, the vast majority of the world demanded restraint on behalf of Israel that would never be demanded of another state. Yes, now looking back after 20 plus years, we know that the war in Afghanistan was perhaps misguided, was all kinds of things. But after 9/11, no one said, oh, you know what, United States, take your time, take a deep breath, don't go on the attack. Let's just figure this out. It's kind of like after World War II example, after Pearl Harbor, no one would have dared to say to the US, to FDR, listen, yes, that was terrible, but what about this? Or what about the Japanese this or that? Let's not go on the attack. So that's the whataboutism. The next argument he outlines is, how about the day after? And I'm sure many of you can think about news shows. They don't say it so much now, but many of them said, yes, Israel has the right to defend itself. And again, I think, gee, thanks. Really, we need you to put up a sign to say we have the right to defend ourselves. But what about the day after? Israel was demanded to move to the next day after the war. Israel was told to listen to Clausewitz, who many of you know, the Art of War.
No, this guy is a
War
speaker.
is the continuation of politics by
No, he's
other
from
means.
California.
You need to mute.
He's very, very smart. You can hear, no?
They said
you?
no war is possible without a clear idea of the goal to be attained. So Israel, don't go into a war unless you know how you're going to get out of a war.
It's
But
just a
once
discussion.
that sounds great in theory, but that just doesn't happen, and certainly didn't in the wake of October 7th. The dissent, Levy said it was obscene to demand of Israel to have a way out, to figure out what's the next day after the war. It just wasn't appropriate in the wake of this war. So
Nancy, could you mute,
we only
please?
have a few minutes left. What I want to see, this was supposed to happen after the war. There was support from some, but very, very little. And what happened in the end? Not just a lack of support, but a dramatic uptick in anti-Semitism. In this country, the ADL says it was on average 400% uptick on the college campuses, where I just heard from it's a new position. It's called College Climate, so it's a weird title, but she's looking at the upsurge in anti-Semitic attacks on college campuses around the country in North America and in Canada. Where the year before there were 2 to 10 anti-Semitic attacks, there was something like 60 in the first half of the year. So a dramatic uptick, 400%, legislations, neo-Nazi marches, all like this. When Dafka, our people in our country, quote, our country, Israel, is attacked, what happens? The world doesn't only not support their retaliation against Hamas, but comes out to lambaste Jews and to say that the Jews themselves should be held responsible for what they're doing. Before the Paris Olympics, a French official on their Olympics team said that they recommended the Israeli athletes to march into Paris not with an Israeli flag and to wear white and not their Israeli flag or Israeli uniforms, so as to minimize the possibility of threats to them, and also to assure people that they weren't going to make a political statement. So what other country, once again, is attacked, and then it's the burden on them, their responsibility to minimize any political stance. Unbelievable. Okay, in 5 minutes. Any last comments at all? Yeah, David?
I'll just throw this in there with respect to yes, but, which is, there seems to be, I would say, a phenomenon where you say to somebody, but there is no occupation of Gaza. And then the yes, but is, well, maybe it's not exactly an occupation, but you've got this blockade, and that caused all these problems. And then you say, well, Egypt also is participating in this blockade, and despite the blockade, all these weapons and all this material and all this aid came in, and you don't blame Hamas for spending it on tunnels and building rockets and building rocket factories while they don't do anything to help their people. You just say, yes, but if Israel wasn't doing this or wasn't doing that.
Yeah, in the end, it's terribly patronizing and condescending of the Arab countries. Say, oh, I guess they're children. They can't be responsible for what they do. So we're not even going to get on their case about what they did. Billions of dollars, billions with a B, going into rockets, missiles, and tunnels, not hospitals, mosques, and schools, right? But it's Israel's fault, to retaliate.
When the New York Times put in pictures of the tunnel that was wide enough for 2 vehicles, not just people, but vehicles going in 2 directions,
right,
not hit each other, and with a full ventilation system to take away the exhaust from the vehicles. I thought, okay, finally people are going to see what this is. Nothing. Right.
Because when people think tunnels, they must think like during Vietnam, the tunnel rats crawling on your belly, small, dang, dark. These aren't tunnels. This is like the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, right? This is like you said, with ventilation and storage capacity, and it just This is and 100 meters down. What does it cost? It costs billions of dollars and 100 miles worth of tunnels. So when even using the word is a misnomer. But you're right. People saw it. I think CNN had some footage. Others, maybe Fox for sure. Didn't matter. It didn't change things. I do have to wonder when I asked the question, is it not Israel's fault, but does Israel share any of the responsibility for not having better hasbara? I don't know. We could have Abba Eban come back from the grave. We could have the best actors and the best writers and producers and Steven Spielberg produce it. I'm not sure what will change people's minds. I'm not sure if it's hard baked into how they see Israel and Jews, which is problematic to put it mildly. I'm not sure. What we have to do is to get allies to understand our predicament, because right now the war for the hearts and minds is being lost. So maybe that's a good place to stop. I wish everybody a really good Yom Holu Sameach, a great Thanksgiving. We're not meeting the next week because it's Thanksgiving. Everybody will be stuffing themselves, but we're meeting the next week.